I have. Okay, I was born in New York during the war, but I don't really remember that. The first home I remember was in Portland, Oregon, and it was a house on Northeast 71st Street. And I lived there until I was 15 or 16 years old. So I went to the same primary school, and I went to the first 2 years of high school while I was living in that home. And most important, while living in that home, our family grew from me alone, I was the firstborn, to 5 children. So 5 of us grew up in that home. Well, I grew up in that home. The younger ones grew up in another house, which became another home, also in Portland, Oregon, where I lived for the last 2 years of high school. Then I went away to college, and I went to college on the other side of the country, so in Massachusetts. But still on holidays, I went home, and home was still Portland, and most important, home was where my family was living. And by that time, there were 6 children. So I was really oriented to that home. And still, when I went away to graduate school in Seattle, still somehow that house, that was home, in the one in Portland. But I think it started to change when I came to Denmark. No. It started to change when I went to Uganda, where I lived for over 2 years with my husband doing ethnographic fieldwork. And at that time, we were adopted by Ugandan families who kind of game at first called us their children. We called them our parents, and we called their children our siblings. But in fact, after a while, the game became a bit serious. And we began to feel that that family in Uganda and where we were staying was also a kind of home. So after we had finished our fieldwork, our long fieldwork in Uganda, we went back to Seattle. And we were only there for 6 months, and that was a funny liminal time because somehow we didn't feel quite at home in Seattle. We had gotten used to life in rural Uganda, and we didn't quite feel comfortable in the US again, even though we thought this should feel like home. We were coming back after all those years away, but it didn't feel quite right. Maybe if we would have stayed, it would have been okay, but after we had been in Seattle for half a year, we got the chance to come to Denmark and teach at the university here in Copenhagen. And 4 months after we arrived in Denmark, our first child was born. And somehow having a child made us begin to put down the roots in Denmark. And we began to feel at home in Denmark. Meanwhile, my mother had died. My family in Portland had changed a lot. My father remarried to a woman who had 4 children. So it didn't feel quite like the home and family that I grew up with. So we lived in Denmark for a while. We thought, maybe we'll somehow go back home to the US. It's still somehow home. But time passed. Our second child was born. We both got tenured jobs, permanent jobs at the University of Copenhagen. And so it began to feel more and more like home. In Copenhagen, we lived in several different houses, apartments at first, and a house. And we began to feel it was home. At the same time, the US was still home in another way, and we would go back on long summer holidays with the kids so they would know their grandparents and their aunties and uncles. But we really began to feel like maybe we have 2 homes. But they were different kinds of homes. At the same time, we still kept contact with those families in Uganda where we had lived for over 2 years. And after the fall of Amin and the advent of a more stable political situation, we started going back to Uganda. And in Uganda, the families that had adopted us thought we should take it seriously and build a house on the family land, which we did. And over the years, since about 1987, 88, we've been going back very regularly to that house and those families in Uganda. So somehow that's also home. And those families are also our families in another way. So yes, I feel like I've had different homes in the course of my life. Okay, well, some of them I've sort of mentioned already. I think certainly having children, my own children, changed my orientation away from the home that I grew up with, the family that I grew up with, and the family that we were making with our own children, and now later with our sons' wives and our grandchildren. So certainly that was one of the series of events that changed my perception of home. That was one thing. Certainly, I think as we grew older and as first my mother died, then my father died, and somehow losing your parents also changes your feeling about home in the sense that family is home, and your home becomes less when you lose your parents. So that was an important event. The connection to Uganda, which happened because of being an anthropologist, I guess, but not all anthropologists keep in touch with the same place in the way that we have done. So I think that doing field work in that place and keeping that connection with those families in Uganda has also been important for changing my perception of home, of one kind of home anyhow. Yeah. Okay, so I've lived in 3 different countries, basically. I've lived in the U.S. In the U.S., I lived in different places because I went to college in Massachusetts, but I took 1 year in Geneva. So I had a taste of living in Europe even before we moved to Denmark. And then of course the Uganda episode. And so did I identify with those cultures? I think certainly you always identify with the place where you grow up. Well, maybe not always, but I certainly did. I certainly felt like the first house and home and that family I grew up in, I certainly identified with it. I identified with Portland, my home place. And when I went to Seattle, I always said, no, my home is Portland. When people would ask me where in the States are you from, I always knew that I identified with Portland. In time, I think I've really grown to identify with Denmark. I've lived here longer than I ever lived in anywhere else. So yes, I feel like I identify with Danish culture, speak Danish. We have Danish daughters-in-law. Our children and grandchildren are all bilingual. So I feel like, yeah, we identify with Denmark. But at the same time, you're never quite Danish. And Danes will always say, well, actually, where do you come from? So you identify, but maybe you always feel you're not quite, as they say in Danish, pæredansk. You weren't actually born here. You came from somewhere else. After spending so much time in Uganda, not just the first long period of field work, but going back about 3 times a year, I certainly identify also with Uganda culture in many ways. And when I talk to people who come from different countries in Africa, or I've worked in different countries in Africa, I say, but in Uganda we do it this way. So I guess that is also an indication of identifying with Ugandan culture in some ways, although never fully. I don't know. I think somehow having these sort of different homes means that you never fully identify with any of them. You feel like you can belong to different places, but you never 100% belong to any one of them. Yeah, I think it's okay. It makes you cosmopolitan, I guess. It makes you it makes you a bit skeptical about the kind of xenophobia or extreme patriotism that is increasingly important in the world today. I think somebody who has lived in, had different homes, lived in different countries, is not going to become that kind of xenophobic patriot. So I think that has been an important effect that has had on me. How else? I mean, of course, just having the experience of living in different places makes you interested in other people who live in different places. And you sort of, I always feel like we who have lived in different places are more eager to welcome, for example, people who move to Denmark, because we know what it was like to move to Denmark. And we know how important it is to have friendly souls who invite you home and show you around and so on. So I think that's been another effect that it's had on me. Well, first of all, it means family. I'm a very family person. I'm very, family is really important to me, not only my own children and grandchildren, but I do and I don't. And I think my first doubts about identifying with my country of birth really happened when we returned after, well, living in Uganda for over 2 years and then traveling around in Africa and then coming back to the US. You know, there's something called culture shock, that when you go to a new country, you're uneasy with how different things are and be a little bit feeling it's awkward and uncomfortable. But there's also something called reverse culture shock. And that's what happened when I went back to the US after being away in Africa for 2.5 years. And not just being in Africa, but really living in a remote place out in the country with people who were really poor, who had all kinds of struggles, but also who were so different in so many ways, but where I had learned to feel at home. And then going back to the States and thinking, okay, now I'm going home. And I should feel right at home. But I actually didn't. I felt uncomfortable. I looked at around me and saw that people were greedy, they were too busy, they weren't open and friendly, they were complaining about things that weren't really serious problems, where I had lived with people where misfortune was everywhere. So I think that's where I started feeling, I'm not really at home in the US. And actually it was that feeling, that reverse culture shock of being uncomfortable, that made us, my husband and I, both interested when an opportunity came to take a job in Denmark, because we really didn't feel quite satisfied to be back in the US. So I guess there started somehow not identifying so much with my country of birth. Now we've been so many years in Denmark, 47 years we've lived here. And I think that kind of first feeling of discomfort has sort of won away, and I can see the good things about the US, and I enjoy going back there, and a lot of things I like about it. But still, I don't feel like I fully identify with my country of birth anymore, because I've lived away from it for longer than I've ever lived there. And also because living away from it, I think you distance yourself also mentally, the values you have, the kind of life that you can live there versus the kind of life we live here. The kind of welfare society we have in Denmark seems to be eminently preferable to the American society. So I feel somehow distanced, but of course you always identify somehow. That's still where part of my family is, and that's where a lot of good memories are of growing up, and it's always fun to go back. So yes and no, I guess that's the answer. The question is, can you have a home if you don't have, if it's not associated with a house? And that's one way of looking at it. And if you say family is home for me, of course, then you don't have to have a house. You can find your family in many different houses, in many different places. You can meet them out of the house and still feel at home with them because they're your family. But I mean, I think generally we do tend to make homes in houses, and maybe that's part of the other part of what home is, that feeling of comfort and familiarity, the place where you can really relax and where you know where everything is and so on. So in a sense, I think home is pretty closely connected to houses. And when I think about the homes I've had, I think about the houses I've lived in. But of course, those houses were filled with family and people I cared about. So yeah, they're related. They're of course two different things. And of course, sometimes I mean, so I lived in different houses in Seattle when we were graduate school students. We lived here and there. We lived in some really cheap basement apartments and so on. So they were houses, but didn't feel very homey. But the places we've lived for a long time, the house I grew up in, our house in Copenhagen, and now our summer house, which we've had some, whatever, 15, 17 years now. Those also feel very homey to me because they're familiar. They have things that we have collected and used and enjoyed over the years, and that also contributes to that feeling of familiarity, which is part of what home is. And those things are in houses, so houses are also an important part of it, I think. I think you can have many homes, and I think the world is getting more and more like that. I think lots of people feel they have several different homes, but I think they're homes in different ways, and it comes back to the idea that home isn't just one thing. So I think you can have more than one home, but that they're going to be homey in different senses too. Okay, well, it was sort of what we were talking about before, but I think it's, first of all, the people that are in that house or that are associated with that house. And even, and in Denmark, a lot of people have summer houses. And then the question is, are those summer houses also? I think for very many people, actually, they feel almost more at home in their summer house than they feel in their regular house. And why is that? I think it's because in the summer house, you go, you relax, you have often your family come to visit you there. So that family part of home is played out there in your summer house. But it's also kind of the feeling of, yeah, of freedom, I guess, because you're away from your work in the sense of your salaried job. You make your you make it the way you want it. You make it the way it feels relaxing, the way it feels fun and interesting. So it's yeah. First of all, having the people in it that makes a house a home. It's the kind of life that you enjoy in it, that sense of familiarity. It's also the things, and I think things are important to making a home. So having for me, having lots of books around and having books that I have read and enjoyed, and books that I still hope that I'm going to read someday, but things that we've had from our travels that we brought back, things people have given us, the things we inherited from our parents and grandparents that are reminding us of our family history. So I think things help to make a house a home also. Where is my home? Well, right now my home, I guess the first and easy answer is it's in Skogsgade in Copenhagen, but it's also in our summer house up in the northern part of Zealand. And sometimes I wake up in the morning and I'm not quite sure which home I'm in. Am I still in town in Skogsgade, or am I up in our other house? So both of them are home. But I still have my home in Uganda, and after I haven't been there for a while, I start getting itchy. I want to go home to Uganda again. And in fact, now in a few weeks, I'm off. I'll be going back to my other home in Uganda. So that's also home somehow. In Uganda, they would say home is where you'll be buried. And if I think of that, I'd probably be Denmark. But the US is also home somehow. I haven't lived there for a very long time. But I guess basically, yeah, where's home? Home is in Denmark. Home is in Copenhagen, but it's also Yukon and Murray up on the north coast where we grow potatoes.